In the Chronicles of Rome, no figure casts a shadow as long and as foul as Tiberius Caesar Augustus, the second emperor of the Roman world. His reign began under the marble dignity of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, yet what emerged was a tale so drenched in cruelty and rumor that even centuries later, historians whisper rather than speak his name too loudly. He was not born a caricature of a tyrant. In his early years, he had been a soldier of iron discipline, a commander who defended Rome's borders and appeared reluctant to rule. But absolute power, once secured, began to peel away the mask. Behind the facade of the Principate, meant to project stability after the chaos of civil war, lurked appetites and fears that would metastasize into something monstrous. What makes Tiberius's story so haunting is not simply the charges of cruelty and sexual depravity leveled against him, but the unsettling possibility that these stories were, in large measure, true. Ancient chroniclers like Tacitus and Suetonius, though writing with their own agendas, painted images that align too consistently across sources to be dismissed entirely as invention. They describe a ruler who, far from Rome, ruled by letters and executions, and who constructed a private world where the imperial body itself became both shrine and instrument of fear. Whether every gruesome detail happened exactly as described is less important than the fact that his contemporaries believed them, lived under their weight, whispered about them, and trembled in the knowledge that their emperor was capable of anything. When Tiberius took power in AD 14, Rome believed itself fortunate. He was the adopted son of Augustus, the architect of empire, and his resume was impeccable. Victories in Germania, administrative competence, and the stoic bearing of a man shaped by hardship. The Republic was gone, replaced by the new facade of the Principate, but many hoped the stern and tested general would preserve Augustus's balance of strength and restraint. For a moment, it seemed that hope was justified. Taxes were steady, borders secure, and the Senate still flattered itself with echoes of relevance. Yet even then, a different story was already beginning, one written in grief, suspicion, and bitterness. The deeper horror of Tiberius lies in this transformation. He began not as a Nero, flamboyantly wasteful, nor as a Caligula, a spectacle of madness from the start. He began as a man who appeared cautious, even reluctant to rule. And yet, as his reign unfolded, he would become remembered as one of the most perverse and feared emperors Rome had ever endured. It is this journey, from soldier to emperor, from ruler to recluse, from recluse to monster, that tonight we begin to trace. What unfolded on the island of Capri in the later years of his reign would leave stains that no river could wash away. The marble of his villas still gleams under the Italian sun, but for those who know the stories, the stones are not monuments, they are crime scenes. To understand how Rome's second emperor became its nightmare, we must start at the beginning, when Tiberius was not yet a figure of dread, but a man marked by wounds that destiny would twist into power.
To understand how Tiberius became the man who cast such a chilling shadow over Rome, we must first return to his beginnings, years before Capri, before the crown, when he was still a figure caught between brilliance and tragedy. Unlike his adoptive father Augustus, who carved Rome's destiny with deliberate ambition, Tiberius was, in many ways, forced into the role of emperor by circumstance and by wounds that never healed. He was born in 42 BC, in the wake of Julius Caesar's assassination, into a world already soaked in civil war. His mother, Livia Drusilla, was a woman of sharp intellect and iron will, whose political instincts would shape her son as much as any military tutor. Livia soon married Augustus, and young Tiberius was drawn into the imperial household, not as Augustus's son by blood, but as his eventual heir by adoption. This lack of natural legitimacy would haunt him, always leaving him conscious of his place as an outsider in his own dynasty. Yet it was not politics alone that carved fissures into his character. Tiberius's private life, unusually well documented for an emperor, shows a man marked by deep personal loss. He loved his first wife, Vipsania Agrippina, with rare devotion. By all accounts, their marriage was warm, even tender, an uncommon luxury among Rome's ruling elite, where political unions were more common than love. But Augustus, ever the strategist, demanded that Tiberius set Vipsania aside in favor of his daughter Julia, whose reputation for promiscuity was infamous even in her own time. The forced divorce devastated Tiberius. Ancient writers say that, years later, he caught sight of Vipsania by chance in the streets of Rome and followed her with such sorrow etched on his face that guards had to intervene. From that moment on, Augustus ensured that the two never saw each other again. The marriage to Julia was a humiliation. She openly entertained lovers, sometimes with flagrant disregard for her husband. Tiberius, reserved and taciturn, endured not only betrayal, but the sting of public mockery. For a man trained in the rigid values of Roman discipline, it was a wound to both pride and spirit. His retreat into silence and bitterness was perhaps less a choice than a defense against a world that had stripped him of what he cherished most. The blows continued. His brother, Drusus the Elder, with whom he shared deep affection, died on campaign in Germania. The loss left Tiberius adrift, cut off from one of the few people who offered him genuine companionship. Drusus had been everything Tiberius was not: charismatic, daring, and beloved by the legions. His death left Tiberius both heir to Augustus's plans and isolated within his own grief. We can see in these early years the seeds of what was to come, the slow layering of bitterness upon bitterness, the silences that thickened into walls, the sense of being trapped in a role never freely chosen. Modern psychologists might speak of unresolved trauma, of repression, of the corrosive power of humiliation. For the Romans, it was simply the fate of a man whose inner life began to corrode long before he wore the purple. And yet, paradoxically, these same wounds forged strength. Tiberius became a soldier of unmatched discipline, leading campaigns with patience and precision rather than reckless glory. In Germania and along the Danube, he earned the loyalty of hardened legions by sharing their hardships, eating their rations, and keeping his word. He returned from these campaigns not a hero in the mold at Alexander, but a commander respected for his methodical, almost cold efficiency. This duality, wounded man and capable general, made him a perfect heir in Augustus's eyes. Here was a man strong enough to preserve the empire, but cautious enough to avoid destabilizing it. And so, when Augustus finally adopted him formally, Rome prepared itself for continuity. Few could have guessed that beneath the surface of this stern, somewhat reluctant man, there were fractures deep enough to one day swallow him whole. By the time Augustus died in AD 14, Tiberius was already a man who had lost too much: his wife, his brother, his dignity in marriage, and the warmth of human closeness. He had learned to mask emotion under discipline, to convert grief into calculation, but such masks can only hold for so long. Behind them, the pressures mount. And when they finally crack, what emerges is often something darker than anyone imagined.
When Augustus died in AD 14, Rome trembled at the transition. Civil wars had devastated the Republic a generation earlier, and few forgot how fragile peace could be when the succession of power faltered. Into this atmosphere stepped Tiberius, a man whose name did not inspire adoration, but respect. He was, above all, a soldier. He had commanded legions, pacified provinces, and secured Rome's frontiers. If he lacked Augustus's charisma, he possessed something else Rome desperately craved: stability. For the first decade of his reign, Tiberius governed with an almost grim efficiency. He preserved many of Augustus's policies, mindful of the danger in overturning what had been carefully built. He was frugal with state funds, earning a reputation for avoiding extravagant games or costly building projects. In an empire where emperors were expected to dazzle with spectacles, Tiberius instead chose restraint. He rarely raised taxes, ensured that grain flowed steadily into Rome, and avoided unnecessary wars that might drain the treasury or lives of Roman citizens. On the surface, it seemed Rome had chosen well.
He gave formal respect to the Senate, allowing it to believe, at least for a time, that it retained some of its ancient dignity. He frequently addressed them with gravity, even professing that he did not wish for absolute power, but only to serve as first among equals. Cynics among the senators may have rolled their eyes, but many breathed a sigh of relief. Tiberius appeared to be a ruler who understood boundaries. Yet beneath this cautious exterior, cracks began to appear. Those closest to him noticed that his speeches in the Senate were often laced with irony, his compliments edged with bitterness. He disliked crowds and grew increasingly withdrawn from public ceremonies. His letters, always terse, grew more caustic as the years passed. For a ruler expected to embody Roman dignity, his disdain for ceremony and popularity became unsettling. Then came the tragedy that altered the balance of his reign. In AD 23, his son Drusus the Younger, the man who might have ensured continuity for the dynasty, died suddenly. Officially, it was illness. Rumors swirled of poison. Ancient writers accused Sejanus, the ambitious praetorian prefect, of orchestrating the death to clear his own path to power. Whether the whispers were true or not, the effect on Tiberius was unmistakable. He was devastated. Those who knew him said that a bitterness already fermenting in his soul turned corrosive after Drusus's death. The emperor, who had once been willing, however reluctantly, to endure the burdens of power, now began to shrink away from them. By the mid-20s AD, Tiberius seemed increasingly disillusioned with the capital itself. He had always been uneasy in Rome, where the Senate's flattery felt hollow and the people's cheers rang false in his ears. He preferred the quiet of the camp or the solitude of his villas. The city that Augustus had made the heart of empire became for Tiberius a theater of hypocrisy he no longer wished to endure. And so the first decade of Tiberius's reign stands as a paradox. Outwardly, he had succeeded. Rome remained prosperous, the frontiers secure, the treasury stable. Inwardly, the emperor was curdling into cynicism, mourning his son, mistrusting his Senate, and recoiling from the very stage on which he was meant to shine. It was not yet the reign of terror that would sear his name into infamy, but the signs were already there: a ruler withdrawing, a man wounded, a mind souring against the world. The mask of competence was still in place, but behind it, the man who once carried legions across Germania was beginning to retreat into shadows he would never emerge from again.
In AD 26, Tiberius made the decision that would define not just his reign, but his reputation for centuries. He abandoned Rome. Officially, the move was framed as a retreat for rest and health, an emperor weary of public life who sought the sea breezes and isolation of an island refuge. Unofficially, it was an abdication in all but name, a withdrawal from the capital into a world of secrecy where his authority could be exercised at distance and his inner darkness given free rein. The choice of Capri was no accident. Situated off the coast of Naples, the island was both beautiful and defensible. Its cliffs dropped straight into the sea, forming natural walls that repelled unwanted visitors. The waters around it were treacherous, its harbors few, making arrival controllable and escape nearly impossible. Capri was paradise turned fortress, a place where the emperor could build his own private stage, shielded from Rome's eyes. Tiberius did not arrive as a solitary exile. He brought with him architects, astrologers, guards, and the vast machinery of imperial service. He ordered the construction of at least 12 villas, each perched in dramatic locations that took advantage of the island's rugged terrain. These villas were not merely retreats of luxury. They were outposts of power. Servants whispered that each contained hidden chambers, pools, and galleries whose purposes were known only to the emperor and those closest to him. From Capri, Tiberius continued to rule through correspondence. Letters, sealed with the imperial signet, carried judgments that determined the fate of men and women across the empire. Some letters brought honors and promotions, but far more carried death sentences.
A senator might arise in the morning, confident in his standing, only to learn by evening that a courier had arrived with orders for his execution. In such a system, silence could be fatal, but words could be worse. Every phrase spoken in Rome risked misinterpretation on Capri. The emperor surrounded himself with a small circle of intimates, chief among them the astrologer Thrasyllus, a Greek who'd once been merely a court intellectual but now became indispensable. Thrasyllus's predictions fed the emperor's paranoia, warning of plots and betrayals. For a ruler already wounded by grief and humiliation, the stars offered both comfort and terror. Each planetary movement was read as confirmation that treachery lurked nearby. In Rome, the Senate continued its ceremonies, but its power was a ghost of the republic it once had been. The real center of authority was now a rocky island in the Bay of Naples. Senators who dared visit Capri returned with haunted eyes, speaking little of what they had seen. Some never returned at all. Rumors swelled to fill the silence, of endless banquets, of sinister rituals, of cries carried by the sea winds. Whether all were true hardly mattered. The perception of horror was enough to shape the empire's imagination. Capri became, in the Roman mind, less a place than a symbol. It was the physical embodiment of withdrawal, secrecy, and corruption. The seat of a ruler who no longer wished to be seen, yet whose hand extended everywhere. From this island fortress, Tiberius would orchestrate not just the administration of the empire, but also the creation of a private world where power and desire blurred into monstrosity. The decision to leave Rome was more than an act of retreat. It was a turning inward, a declaration that the emperor no longer needed the facade of public virtue. On Capri, he could shape reality as he pleased, unchecked, unobserved, and absolute. And once power is withdrawn from the gaze of the governed, it begins to twist in ways darker than anyone can imagine.
From Capri, Tiberius transformed the machinery of Roman governance into something at once efficient and terrifying. The emperor had always been a man of letters, preferring terse written commands to lengthy speeches, but now correspondence became the lifeblood of his rule. Each sealed dispatch that left Capri carried the weight of life or death. To open a letter bearing the imperial signet was to feel the pulse of fear itself. The Senate, once the proud deliberative body of the Republic, was reduced to a ritual stage. Senators gathered, spoke the required words, and voted unanimously on measures already determined far away. Their true task was not governance but survival. To hesitate when confirming one of Tiberius's edicts was to invite suspicion. To show mercy in a trial was to appear disloyal. The chamber that had once debated the fate of Carthage now trembled at the scratch of a stylus across wax. In Rome, a culture of suspicion flourished. Informers, delatores, proliferated, men who built their fortunes by accusing others of treason, or maestas. A careless remark, a line of verse, even a facial expression could be twisted into evidence of disloyalty. The reward for a successful accusation was the confiscated estate of the condemned. Thus, fear and greed merged into a single system of exploitation. Families destroyed in the morning enriched their neighbors by nightfall. Visitors who braved the journey to Capri described a court unlike anything Rome had ever known. The emperor was elusive, often cloaked in silence, sometimes appearing only to deliver a brief command before retreating again. Audiences were rare and terrifying. Senators summoned to the island returned visibly shaken, their voices lowered as if the cliffs themselves had ears. Some did not return at all, their names erased from public rolls, their property seized, their families scattered. The isolation of Capri magnified the atmosphere of dread. The villas perched on cliffs seemed designed not only for luxury, but for surveillance. Guards patrolled every path, their orders absolute.
Servants whispered of chambers where voices were carried through hidden vents, ensuring that nothing said in private remained private. Even the sea, sparkling under the Mediterranean sun, became an accomplice. From its surface, cries from unseen places echoed, borne by the wind before vanishing into silence. Tiberius's paranoia deepened with each passing year. He trusted few and suspected many. The astrologer Thrasyllus remained by his side, feeding him visions of betrayal written in the heavens. Soldiers, slaves, and senators alike lived at the mercy of omens. A bird's flight, a thunderclap, a misread star could condemn a man to death. And yet in this cloistered fortress, power remained absolute. Roads were still repaired, taxes still collected, armies still supplied. To the provinces, the empire appeared stable. Merchants traded, farmers sowed, markets bustled. But those in Rome knew better. The empire was not governed from the capital, but from an island of fear, where letters served as executions, and silence itself could be deadly. It was here, in this climate of suspicion and secrecy, that the darker side of Tiberius's nature began to unfold. For if Capri was a fortress against treachery, it was also a laboratory of desire. A private kingdom, where the emperor, freed from scrutiny, would construct a world that blended luxury, paranoia, and perversion in ways Rome had never seen before.
The island of Capri, breathtaking in its natural beauty, became under Tiberius something else entirely. A stage for perversion so grotesque that even hardened Romans shuddered to repeat the stories. Here, the emperor constructed not just villas, but playgrounds for his darkest fantasies. 12 palaces of marble and mosaic where the lines between luxury and horror blurred into something unrecognizable. Each villa, perched high on cliffs or hidden among grottos, was designed to satisfy a different appetite. Pools shimmered with clear water, but they were not mere ornaments of leisure. They became the infamous sites of games whispered about for generations. Suetonius describes how children, boys and girls alike, were brought to Capri under pretexts of education or service. Once there they became minnows, trained to swim between the emperor's legs, nibbling at his body in grotesque aquatic rituals. The word itself, innocent in other contexts, became permanently tainted with associations of exploitation. And the pools were only the beginning. Within his villas, Tiberius is said to have staged elaborate spectacles of sexual cruelty. Young men and women were forced into acts before his eyes, arranged in pairs or groups he called chains. Erotic art and scrolls from Greece and the East filled his libraries, not as curiosities but as instruction manuals. His walls were lined with frescoes too explicit for public display, turning entire chambers into immersive theaters of stimulation. Even veteran courtiers, men accustomed to Rome's notorious vices, recoiled at the inventions of the emperor's imagination. Perhaps most disturbing was the creation of the spintrii, youths specially trained in specific sexual acts. These were not courtesans or slaves in the ordinary sense, but children taken from families, sold by desperate parents, or seized in raids. Their education consisted of nothing but the arts of pleasure. Their lives were stripped of all identity except their usefulness to the emperor's desires. So infamous did the term become that spintrii was rarely spoken in polite society thereafter. Survival for these children was rare. Many perished from the toll of their service, others were silenced permanently to ensure no whisper of Capri's secrets reached Rome. The few who survived carried scars, physical, psychological, spiritual, that no freedom could erase. But the emperor could not maintain this shadow kingdom alone. An entire system of collaborators emerged to sustain it. Young nobles, eager for favor, offered their own siblings or children. Ambitious men became procurers, scouring provinces for victims to present as gifts. Greed and fear merged into an economy where human flesh was the currency. To refuse was dangerous. To participate was lucrative. In this way, depravity became institutionalized, woven into the fabric of imperial politics. The stories multiplied with each telling. Infants still nursing, noble virgins forced into mock religious rites, victims thrown from cliffs when they ceased to amuse. Soldiers stationed below ensured no one survived the fall. Whether each tale is exact truth matters less than what they reveal, that Romans, hardened by spectacles of gladiators and slavery, still found themselves horrified by what they believed their emperor capable of. Capri became a byword for corruption, its cliffs symbols not of beauty but of blood. This was no longer the Tiberius who had once shared rations with his soldiers on campaign, who had governed Rome with frugal steadiness. On Capri, that mask had fallen completely. What remained was not just cruelty but creativity in cruelty, a deliberate engineering of perversion that transformed power itself into a theater of horror.
To feed the monstrous appetites of Capri, Tiberius required more than secrecy, he required accomplices. And in the poisoned atmosphere of his reign, there was no shortage of men willing to transform evil into opportunity. What began as whispers of perversion grew into an organized system, a machinery of exploitation, where human life was traded as casually as grain or wine. Ambitious nobles discovered that offering their children or those of others could purchase imperial favor more effectively than a speech in the Senate. Governors of provinces, eager to prove their loyalty, sent shipments of boys and girls alongside tribute. Slave traders, pirates, and kidnappers found new markets in the emperor's court, where beauty, youth, and innocence fetched the highest price. What might have been hidden shame elsewhere became open currency in Capri's economy of horror. To resist this system was perilous. Magistrates who hesitated to supply victims, or fathers who balked at sacrificing their daughters, found themselves accused of treason. Their estates were seized, their families destroyed. The law, once a shield, had become a weapon. Thus, complicity was not just rewarded, it was demanded. Participation in depravity became a mechanism of survival, a demonstration of loyalty. In Rome, silence meant safety. On Capri, collaboration meant life. This corruption spread outward, infecting the empire like a disease. Senators whispered among themselves, weighing how many lives it was worth to keep their positions intact. Soldiers, once symbols of discipline, became executioners or guards at the villas, ensuring that victims could not flee. Even households far from the capital learned the lesson. Prosperity was dangerous, daughters were liabilities, and trust could cost lives. The psychological effect was devastating. The Roman elite, once bound by honor and tradition, learned that virtue itself could be fatal. To object openly was to die. To resist quietly was to lose everything. And so men and women who might once have stood against evil became its enablers, each choice rationalized as necessity, each compromise another step into complicity. The stories that emerged from Capri reflect not only Tiberius's personal perversions, but the system that sustained them. A chilling tale speaks of infants still at the breast, subjected to unspeakable acts, while noble virgins were forced into grotesque parodies of sacred rites. When victims no longer pleased, some were hurled from the cliffs, their bodies dashed upon rocks below, with guards ensuring that none survived to tell the tale. Whether exaggerated or not, these accounts reveal something more profound. Romans believed their emperor capable of such horrors. And in a society where rumor itself could kill, belief carried as much weight as fact. Parents frightened children into obedience with the bogeyman of Capri. Senators flinched at the thought of being summoned to the island. Even slaves, hardened by lives of suffering, whispered prayers when couriers arrived bearing the emperor's seal. Tiberius had built more than villas. He had built an empire of fear, where corruption was the mortar and survival the only law. What happened behind the guarded walls of Capri may never be fully known, but the terror it generated reshaped Rome itself, twisting loyalty, family, and law into tools of submission.
If Tiberius's sexual appetites shocked Rome, it was his cruelty that cemented his reign as one of terror. For behind the closed doors of Capri, power was not merely used to indulge lust, it was weaponized to break souls. Pleasure and punishment became indistinguishable, and the emperor, once the stern general of Germania, now reveled in suffering as though it were an art. He invented torments that blurred the line between entertainment and execution. Prisoners sentenced to die were sometimes reprieved at the last moment, only to be killed days later when hope had returned. Parents were forced to watch their children executed, or worse, compelled to participate in the killing themselves. Senators who had once debated the fate of nations now found themselves actors in macabre theater, performing loyalty while grief hollowed them from within. The charge of maestas, injury to the majesty of the Roman people, became the emperor's favorite instrument of terror. Once a legal safeguard against treason, it was twisted into a net that could ensnare anyone. A coin bearing the emperor's face carried into a latrine was grounds for death. A careless remark about the weather could be reinterpreted as a veiled insult. Even silence, if judged sullen or resistant, could be fatal. Professional informers, the delatores, thrived in this environment. They prowled banquets and marketplaces, listening for slips of the tongue, ready to denounce even family members if it meant reward. Estates of the condemned filled imperial coffers, enriching not only the emperor, but the network of parasites who sustained his regime. In Rome, friendships dissolved, families turned inward, and conversation itself withered into silence. Torture, once used sparingly, became routine. Ancient sources describe methods both brutal and grotesque. Victims forced to drink until their bladders swelled, their genitals bound with cords that turned relief into agony. Nobles flogged like slaves, women humiliated in ways meant to destroy their dignity as much as their bodies. Tiberius took a perverse delight in these innovations, sometimes watching, sometimes devising new refinements of pain. The Senate, reduced to trembling sycophants, voted unanimously for every execution, each senator desperate to outdo the others in displays of loyalty. Clemency itself became a crime. To hesitate in condemning a colleague was to mark oneself as suspect. And so Rome's proudest men, descendants of those who had stood against Hannibal and Carthage, collapsed into cowardice, preferring survival to honor. Suicide became for some the only escape. Senators opened their veins rather than endure trial, knowing that in death they might preserve some dignity for their families. Others destroyed their own writings, burned their poems, silenced their voices forever, rather than risk a single word being turned against them. The vibrant intellectual life of Rome dimmed, smothered under the weight of fear. The empire functioned, roads repaired, taxes collected, armies supplied, but its heart was poisoned. Law had become cruelty, loyalty had become complicity, and fear was the true emperor. Tiberius had succeeded in something no invader had ever accomplished. He had conquered Rome from within, replacing its traditions of honor and civic duty with terror as the currency of survival.
By the late 20s AD, the empire resembled a great stage where every actor feared a hidden audience. Rome's streets bustled, markets overflowed, temples rang with prayers. But beneath the noise lay silence of another kind. Conversation itself had withered. At banquets, men once famed for their wit now whispered only banalities, fearful that even laughter might be misinterpreted. A sigh, a frown, a hesitation could be fatal if carried to Capri by the wrong ears. Parents taught their children not only manners, but survival. Guard your tongue even in sleep, some warned, terrified that a careless murmur might be overheard by a servant or sibling. Trust between friends, between spouses, between families dissolved. Letters were burned after reading, poems hidden or destroyed, archives purged of anything that might be twisted into evidence. Roman society, once defined by open debate and public oratory, now lived behind masks of silence. Even death could not release a victim from Tiberius's grasp. The emperor was known to prosecute the deceased, stripping families of property and honor. Children were executed for mourning parents too openly, their grief reinterpreted as rebellion. Ancient laws, long forgotten, were dredged up and reinterpreted to suit paranoia. Justice no longer protected the people, it served only to magnify imperial suspicion. The psychological toll was immense. Senators who had once prided themselves on eloquence now competed only in flattery. Intellectuals who had once dared to question the gods now buried their manuscripts in fear. The Republic's proud legacy of argument and dissent was replaced by nervous compliance, an empire outwardly strong but inwardly hollowed. Meanwhile, on Capri, Tiberius himself decayed. Suetonius and Tacitus describe a man physically ravaged, his skin covered in sores, his face disfigured, his hair replaced by wigs, his features hidden beneath layers of ointments and cosmetics. The emperor, who had once been a stern soldier, now resembled a ghastly caricature of his former self, a diseased satyr lurking in marble villas. Paranoia drove him deeper into isolation. Food was tested on condemned prisoners before he would touch it. Guards slept outside his chamber doors, each watching the others as much as the emperor. His letters, once brisk and practical, grew darker, consumed with suspicion and threats. It seemed as if Tiberius trusted nothing, neither gods nor men, neither senate nor family. And yet, his power remained absolute. The empire continued to function because fear compelled obedience. Farmers sowed fields, merchants traded goods, soldiers drilled in camps. But the soul of Rome was changing. Where once Romans had lived in the confidence of civic honor, they now survived in the knowledge that life itself hung on the whims of an emperor hidden on a distant island. In this climate, silence became wisdom, complicity became safety, and fear became Rome's truest law. Tiberius had done what no barbarian invasion could achieve. He had severed the bonds of trust that held Roman society together. Capri was far away, yet its shadow stretched over every household, every marketplace, every whispered word in the empire.
4 years, the empire's daily governance had fallen into the hands of Lucius Aelius Sejanus, the Praetorian prefect. Charismatic, ambitious, and utterly ruthless, Sejanus became the most powerful man in Rome while Tiberius lingered on Capri. To many, he was the emperor in all but name, a man who decided trials, directed policy, and commanded the loyalty of the elite guard stationed in the capital. At first, Sejanus played the role of loyal lieutenant. He shielded Tiberius from the burdens of government, carried out orders, and built the Praetorian Guard into a formidable power within Rome itself. But ambition cannot long remain masked. Whispers spread that Sejanus sought to marry into the imperial family, even to position himself as heir. With the emperor secluded, paranoid, and aging, the prospect of a successor looming over Capri unsettled the Senate and thrilled opportunists. For a time, it seemed that Tiberius trusted Sejanus completely. The prefect's enemies found themselves accused of treason and swiftly eliminated. Statues of Sejanus appeared in public spaces, honors once reserved for the emperor alone now granted to his minister. Senators vied for his favor, knowing that to cross him was to invite ruin. Rome bent the knee not to Capri but to the Praetorian barracks. But absolute power admits no rivals. In AD 31, the emperor's paranoia turned its gaze upon his own prefect. Historians disagree on what triggered the reversal. Perhaps Thrasyllus whispered that the stars foretold Sejanus's betrayal, or perhaps the sheer scale of Sejanus's ambition made him intolerable even to Tiberius. Whatever the cause, the trap was sprung with cruel precision. A letter arrived from Capri read aloud in the Senate. At first, it seemed to praise Sejanus, and his supporters beamed with confidence. But as the scroll was unrolled, the tone shifted. Accusations of conspiracy, betrayal, and treason poured forth. Senators froze. The man they had courted, whose statues they had erected, was suddenly an enemy of the state. The fall was immediate and catastrophic. Sejanus was dragged from the chamber and executed the same day. His statues were toppled and smashed. His children were slaughtered, their bodies thrown into the streets. Anyone associated with him, friends, clients, allies, was destroyed in a purge that claimed hundreds of lives. One girl, too young under Roman law to be executed, was raped by the executioner so that the legal requirement might be met. The city descended into a frenzy of fear and vengeance. Neighbors denounced neighbors, families betrayed one another, desperate to distance themselves from the disgraced prefect. Senators who had once lavished Sejanus with praise now competed to condemn him more loudly, hoping to prove their loyalty to Capri. Rome had seen political purges before, but none on this scale, none so soaked in blood. And behind it all, Tiberius remained on Capri, untouched, orchestrating the chaos from afar. His letters carried death as surely as swords, his paranoia reshaping the empire in a single stroke. If Sejanus had once been the face of tyranny in Rome, his downfall proved an even darker truth. The emperor needed no deputy to spread terror. His absence was enough.
After the fall of Sejanus, Rome did not breathe easier. It suffocated. The purge that followed was not a cleansing of corruption, but a widening of terror. With his once trusted prefect destroyed, Tiberius turned suspicion on everyone. The Senate, already broken by fear, now became an assembly of executioners, each senator eager to denounce his colleagues before being denounced himself. Accusations multiplied. Men who had dined with Sejanus, praised him, or merely failed to oppose him loudly enough, were dragged into court. Entire families were destroyed, estates confiscated, names erased. Children were executed alongside their parents. Husbands and wives were forced to testify against each other. Even the dead were not spared. Tiberius ordered posthumous trials, stripping honor and wealth from men who could no longer defend themselves. The trials themselves became theater. Defendants were paraded before senators who already knew the verdict. Informers shouted charges, often baseless, but it mattered little. Tortures supplied whatever confessions were needed. Whips, racks, fire, and ingenious cruelties wrung false words from broken bodies. Once condemned, there was no appeal, no mercy. The empire that had once prided itself on law was now a machine of legalized savagery. The psychological cruelty was worse than the physical. A senator who lost a son might be ordered to preside over the next session of the Senate as if nothing had happened. Parents were forced to watch their children executed, their grief measured for signs of disloyalty. Some victims were granted a brief reprieve, only to be executed days later when hope had begun to stir. This sadism was deliberate. The emperor enjoyed the spectacle of suffering prolonged. Fear penetrated every level of society. Writers destroyed their manuscripts, poets burned their verses. Even private jokes could kill, for a servant might repeat them to curry favor. In homes across Rome, silence reigned. Fathers warned sons never to trust friends, wives concealed grief behind smiles. Children learned early that love itself might be dangerous. The civic spirit that had once defined Rome, argument, oratory, debate, was smothered into submission. Meanwhile, on Capri, Tiberius reveled in isolation, his paranoia swelling with his age and infirmity. He trusted no one, not even his guards, who watched each other as closely as they watched him. He experimented with poisons and antidotes, tested on slaves or condemned prisoners. He surrounded himself with astrologers and magicians, seeking assurance from the stars as he doubted every human voice. Rome had become a city of masks, every face smiling in public while terror gnawed in private. The empire still collected taxes, built roads, and fed its people, but the soul of its governance was gone. What remained was fear, sharpened to a knife's edge, wielded by an emperor who seemed to take satisfaction in cutting away the bonds that once held Rome together. For 20 years, Augustus had built trust between emperor and senate. In a handful of years, Tiberius reduced it to ashes. The reign of pure terror had no precedent in Rome's history, and it left scars that would haunt the empire for generations.
By the early 30s AD, Tiberius had become a grotesque shadow of the disciplined soldier who once marched at the head of legions. Time, illness, and his own vices had corroded him from within. Ancient sources describe his body as ravaged by sores and disease, his face mottled and disfigured, hidden beneath wigs and layers of cosmetics. To those who glimpsed him on Capri, the emperor seemed less like a man than a ghoul lingering in twilight, an emperor of shadows, half rotting, half alive. Paranoia consumed his every breath. He tested each meal on condemned prisoners before daring to taste it. He surrounded himself with guards, who themselves were watched by other guards, each set of eyes suspecting betrayal. He relied on astrologers like Thrasyllus to read treachery in the stars, condemning men based on planetary alignments. When he consulted oracles, their predictions often sealed the fates of senators, generals, even children. The empire felt his madness in waves. A gesture in Rome, a raised eyebrow at Capri could spark a purge that wiped out entire families. Senators no longer merely feared their emperor, they feared the silence between his letters when no order came, and suspicion itself became unbearable. To live under Tiberius was to live in a constant gamble. Would the next courier bring a reprieve or a death sentence? His cruelty also took new forms. He devised fresh torments for prisoners, engineering suffering as though it were a craft. Some victims were drowned in wine, others mutilated for amusement. The line between execution and entertainment blurred. Stories circulated of noble women humiliated in mock trials, of senators forced to laugh at their own condemnation, of parents ordered to embrace their children one final time before both were slain. Even if embellished, these accounts reflected the truth of Roman belief. Their emperor was capable of anything. And yet, Capri itself remained a paradox. Its cliffs and waters shone with dazzling beauty, its villas glittered with luxury, but to those who lived within its orbit, the island was cursed. Servants whispered that the walls themselves absorbed screams. Soldiers stationed there returned changed, their eyes hollow. Visitors who survived their audiences with Tiberius spoke little afterward, as if words could not capture the abyss they had glimpsed. In Rome, whispers of the emperor's decay became dangerous currency. Some said he was no longer fully human, that he had become a kind of monster, his diseased body mirroring the corruption of his soul. Others saw in his decline the hand of divine wrath, punishment for blasphemies committed in secret rites. Earthquakes, floods, and fires during these years were interpreted as omens, proof that the gods themselves recoiled from Rome's ruler. Yet the machinery of empire did not collapse. Taxes continued to flow, the legions remained disciplined, trade routes carried goods across seas. This was perhaps the most chilling aspect of Tiberius's reign. Horror and normalcy coexisted. Farmers plowed fields while senators plotted each other's downfall. Children played in Roman streets while other children vanished into Capri's villas. The empire functioned, but its heart was rotten, its people broken. The mask of power, once worn with stern dignity, had crumbled completely. What remained was raw tyranny, stripped of illusion, embodied in the decaying figure of an emperor who ruled not through love or respect, but through the sheer weight of terror.
As Tiberius entered his 70s, his body weakened, but his malice seemed only to sharpen. Age dulled the excesses of his lust, but it did not soften his cruelty. If anything, freed from the distractions of desire, he devoted himself more fully to the art of fear.
The villas of Capri, once infamous for their orgies, now became stages for executions, interrogations, and rituals of humiliation. The emperor's obsession turned increasingly toward death, his own and everyone else's. He consulted astrologers daily, desperate to know the hour of his demise, yet executed those who predicted it too soon. He feared death, yet seemed to court it by venturing unexpectedly to the mainland, where his presence terrified entire communities. These journeys resembled the march of a plague. Families locked away their daughters, towns fell into silence, and even veterans who had once cheered their general now looked upon him with dread. His cruelty acquired a ritualistic quality. Prisoners were sometimes reprieved, only to be executed days later in front of their families. Noblemen were forced to attend banquets immediately after the deaths of loved ones, compelled to smile and flatter while grief hollowed them from within. A senator might dine at the emperor's table one evening, only to be accused of treason and condemned the next morning. This unpredictability magnified terror. No one could feel secure, not even for an hour. The fall of Sejanus had left Rome in ruins, politically and socially, but Tiberius continued the purges with tireless energy. Friends of the prefect were hunted down, their families annihilated. The innocent and guilty alike vanished into prisons or were hurled from Capri's cliffs. The law was stretched to absurdity. A man could be condemned for carrying a coin with the emperor's image into a brothel. Another for criticizing verses Tiberius had written in his youth. The charge of maiestas had become so elastic that any word, gesture, or silence could be deemed an insult to imperial majesty. Meanwhile, the Senate disintegrated into little more than a chorus of fear. Once the deliberative body of the Republic, it now existed to echo the emperor's paranoia. Senators competed to outdo each other in flattery and cruelty, knowing that a single act of mercy might be fatal. Some chose suicide rather than risk trial, hoping that by taking their own lives they could preserve a fraction of their family's wealth. Even in death, however, Tiberius often pursued them, prosecuting the deceased to confiscate estates. Rome had become a graveyard of trust. Neighbors feared neighbors, friends feared friends, children feared their parents. Informers grew rich, feasting on the misery of others. The ordinary rhythm of Roman life, banquets, festivals, debates, and laughter, was hollowed out, replaced by the heavy silence of suspicion. And yet through it all, Tiberius clung to power with iron grip. Though his body decayed, though his face was ravaged by sores and disguised with wigs and ointments, his letters carried death sentences across the empire with the same cold authority. His name alone was enough to unman the Senate, to silence poets, to strike fear into generals commanding distant legions. In these final years, Tiberius was no longer a ruler of men, but a collector of suffering, a connoisseur of fear. His legacy had shifted from corruption of flesh to corruption of spirit. Rome, outwardly strong, inwardly rotted under the weight of his cruelty. And as the emperor stared into his own approaching death, he dragged an empire with him into darkness.
The end came in March of AD 37, after 23 years of rule. Tiberius was 77 years old, his body ravaged by disease, his mind consumed with paranoia. He had lived long enough to outlast rivals, heirs, and even his own appetites, but not long enough to escape the death he had so long feared. Ancient accounts describe his final days with a mixture of horror and grim satisfaction. He lay bedridden at the villa of Lucullus, still issuing orders for executions from his couch, still muttering suspicions against those around him. His attendants whispered of a man half alive, clinging to power even as life slipped away. When word spread that the emperor had finally died, Rome erupted in a frenzy of relief.
Crowds poured into the streets, cheering, shouting, demanding that his body be hurled into the Tiber like a criminal's corpse. "To the Tiber with Tiberius," they cried, as if throwing his memory into the river could wash away 20 years of fear. Yet the Senate, bound by ritual, moved cautiously. There was hesitation over whether Tiberius should receive divine honors as Augustus had. Many senators resisted, so deep was the hatred he inspired. It was only through the intervention of his successor, Caligula, that Tiberius was granted the burial rites due to an emperor. Even then, the funeral was perfunctory, stripped of genuine mourning. Where Augustus had been remembered with tears, Tiberius was sent to his grave with curses. Rumors clung even to his death. Some said he had died naturally, alone and bitter. Others claimed that he had begun to recover, rising briefly from his bed, only to be smothered with pillows by his successor's allies, perhaps by Macro, the new Praetorian prefect, eager to secure Caligula's ascension. Whether by nature or murder, the result was the same. The reign of terror had ended. But though his body was gone, the scars remained. Rome was free of Tiberius, but not of the world he had created. The Senate, once broken, would never regain its dignity. The treason trials he had perfected became a permanent feature of imperial politics. Informers and torturers, once empowered, continued to thrive. The people of Rome, who had learned that their emperor could be a monster, never forgot the lesson. The reign of Tiberius ended not with reverence, but with revulsion. He died as he had lived in his later years, isolated, feared, and despised. In the chronicles of history, his name would not be remembered for his early victories or his administrative caution, but for the abyss of cruelty into which he dragged the empire.
The death of Tiberius did not erase his reign, it magnified it. For Rome, the memory of Capri lingered like a curse. Parents frightened their children into obedience with the name of Tiberius. Graffiti scrawled on walls mocked his perversions long after his body was laid to rest. His villas stood empty, avoided as though haunted, their marble halls echoing not with laughter, but with whispers of the horrors they had housed. Historians like Tacitus and Suetonius, writing decades later, struggled to describe what had occurred without recoiling in disgust. Their words, though colored by political bias, carried the weight of consistency. Too many stories aligned, too many rumors shared the same shape. Even if some details were exaggerated, the essence was undeniable. Tiberius had twisted the Principate into a machine of terror, blending personal lust with state power until the two were indistinguishable. The cultural consequences were immense. Rome's intellectual life, once vibrant, had been stifled. Writers had burned their works, poets had silenced their voices, orators had traded eloquence for survival. The Senate, stripped of courage, never recovered its dignity. The habit of submission, once learned, became permanent. Future emperors would find the body of Rome already trained to bow. Religious life, too, had been poisoned. Tiberius had desecrated rituals, mocked the gods, and turned sacred ceremonies into theater for his own appetites. Natural disasters during his reign, earthquakes, floods, fires, were remembered as divine judgment on the empire. Mystery cults retreated underground. Philosophers turned to inner virtue as a defense against outer tyranny, and ordinary Romans began to look elsewhere for meaning. The ground had been laid for the rise of new spiritual movements, Christianity among them, that promised justice beyond the reach of corrupt emperors. Economically, the empire survived, but at a cost. The confiscations that funded Tiberius's purges destroyed noble families and discouraged ambition. Wealth was hidden. Investment stalled. Trade faltered under the shadow of paranoia. An entire economy of fear had taken root, with human lives as its currency. Even after his death, that distortion lingered. For once a society learns to profit from terror,
it rarely forgets the lesson. Perhaps the greatest wound was psychological. Rome had seen corruption before, cruelty before, but never such intimacy between private perversion and public policy. Tiberius had shown that civilization's veneer could crack in an instant, revealing savagery beneath. He proved that an emperor could be not merely incompetent, not merely cruel, but monstrous, and that the empire would still function, still collect taxes, still march legions, even as its heart rotted. His reign left Rome with the terrible knowledge that no system, however glorious, was safe from the darkness within a single man.
The shadow of Tiberius did not fade with his death. Instead, it settled into the marrow of Rome, altering forever the relationship between ruler and ruled. Once, Romans had imagined the Principate as a compromise between monarchy and republic, a system in which an emperor guided but did not tyrannize. After Tiberius, that illusion was shattered. The people now knew an emperor could become a predator, and the empire would still march on. Subsequent rulers were measured against him. Caligula, his successor, would inherit not only the throne, but the example of Capri. And though his reign veered toward madness of a different flavor, the specter of Tiberius was never far behind. Nero, too, would be judged against the standard of perversion and cruelty that Capri had established. Even the rare good emperors benefited from the comparison. Against Tiberius, almost anyone appeared merciful. For centuries, his name became a byword for perversion. Roman writers used Tiberian as shorthand for corruption that blended political power with sexual depravity. Later historians, medieval monks, Renaissance scholars all returned to the horror of his story as both fascination and warning. Few emperors have been remembered with such consistent disgust. The scars he left were not only historical but moral. Rome's trust in its institutions, already fragile, was poisoned. The Senate had been humiliated into submission, its courage stripped away. Law had been perverted into a weapon of fear, precedent twisted into cruelty. These changes proved enduring. Treason trials, informers, and political purges became part of imperial governance, revived again and again whenever an insecure emperor sought to tighten his grip. Even art and literature bore the mark of his reign. The silence of poets, the cautious allegories of historians, the retreat into myth and safe subjects, these were the cultural echoes of Tiberian fear. Generations of Romans grew up learning not eloquence, but survival. How to flatter without appearing insincere, how to remain invisible, how to betray before being betrayed. And yet, in remembering Tiberius, there is also a grim form of hope. For all his power, he died despised, abandoned, mocked. The empire outlasted him, producing emperors who were competent, even noble. His terror was not eternal. His cruelty was not immortal. He proved that absolute power can corrupt utterly, but also that evil, even on an imperial scale, leaves behind not triumph, but revulsion. The lesson is timeless. Societies fall into danger not only when monsters arise, but when ordinary people enable them, when silence, fear, and complicity allow cruelty to flourish unchecked. Tiberius may have been one man, but his reign was made possible by thousands of courtiers, guards, procurers, and informers who chose survival over principle. In their choices lies the true warning: tyranny is never the work of one alone. Thus, the legacy of Tiberius is twofold: a monument to the depths of human depravity and a cautionary tale about the fragility of civilization itself.
The story of Tiberius is not just a chapter of Roman history,
It is a mirror held up to human nature. His reign forces us to ask unsettling questions. How can a man begin as a disciplined general, a capable administrator, and end as a monster reviled by his own people? Was it the tragedies of his youth, the loss of his brother and son, the forced marriages and betrayals that twisted his soul? Or was the cruelty always there, hidden, waiting for power to strip away restraint? Modern psychology might name his demons: sadistic personality disorder, paranoia, sexual deviance, but such labels feel inadequate. They reduce horror to clinical terms, when in truth his evil was lived and felt by thousands. It was the cries of children torn from their families, the silence of senators too terrified to speak, the despair of mothers forced to sacrifice daughters for survival. No diagnosis captures the abyss of a man who could turn paradise into a slaughterhouse. What makes Tiberius truly terrifying is not just what he did, but what he revealed: that civilization is fragile, that law and culture are no bulwark against a determined tyrant. The Rome of Augustus had seemed invincible, its armies unchallenged, its culture flourishing, its government stable. Yet within a single generation, that same Rome bent beneath the weight of one man's appetites and fears. The lesson is stark. Greatness offers no immunity to corruption. His reign also shows the danger of complicity. Tiberius did not act alone. Procurers scoured the empire for victims. Senators voted for executions. Informers grew rich on denunciations. Guards threw children from cliffs. Each of them made a choice, telling themselves survival required it. Evil flourished not because of one emperor, but because thousands allowed it, participated in it, profited from it. The monster wore the purple, but it was Rome that fed his power. And so, the story of Tiberius endures as a warning. Power without conscience creates monsters. Fear without resistance sustains them. Civilization is never more than a thin veneer, one crisis away from collapse. Capri's cliffs remind us that beauty can coexist with horror, that human hands can transform paradise into a place of nightmares. 2,000 years later, his name remains synonymous with corruption. Not because of his early victories, not because of his governance, but because he demonstrated the darkest possibility of empire, that when unchecked, the ruler of the civilized world could descend into savagery worse than any barbarian. Rome survived Tiberius, but it never forgot him. Neither should we.
After Tiberius's death, Rome tried to move forward, but the memory of his reign lingered like a wound that refused to heal. Capri's villas stood as silent ruins, avoided by Romans who believed the stones themselves had absorbed the cries of victims. Tourists, centuries later, would marvel at their engineering, their mosaics, their views of the sea, yet behind the beauty lay a darker truth, invisible but ineradicable. Paradise had once been turned into hell. The Senate, though freed from his tyranny, never recovered its honor. Broken by years of submission, it became a body of sycophants, its courage extinguished. Once it had guided the Republic, now it existed only to echo imperial will. The treason trials, the culture of informers, the twisting of law into a weapon. These precedents outlived Tiberius, resurfacing under Nero, Domitian, and others. His reign had written cruelty into Rome's political DNA. Art and literature bore scars too. Generations of writers grew cautious, speaking in allegories, whispering truths behind veils of myth. Some of Rome's greatest poets turned to silence, their voices extinguished by fear. What was lost in those years, manuscripts burned, thoughts unwritten, courage abandoned, can never be recovered. The silence of history itself is part of his legacy. Religion, too, changed in his shadow.
Romans, disillusioned with state rituals perverted by an emperor, sought solace elsewhere. Stoicism taught that inner virtue could endure even when the world decayed. Mystery cults promised salvation beyond death, and in the provinces, the seeds of Christianity were sprouting, nourished by the hunger for a justice that emperors could not corrupt. In this way, the evil of Tiberius paradoxically prepared the ground for Rome's eventual spiritual transformation. Even the empire's enemies took note. Allied kings whispered about the horrors of Capri. Barbarian tribes questioned the moral authority of Rome. To rule the world and yet permit such monstrosity at its center weakened the empire's claim to civilization. For centuries, Rome had justified its conquests by presenting itself as the bearer of law and order. Tiberius exposed the lie. The empire could be as savage as those it conquered. And yet, memory itself became a form of resistance. By recording his crimes, historians like Tacitus and Suetonius ensured that Tiberius's victims were not forgotten. The whispers of servants, the graffiti of commoners, the chronicles of senators all coalesced into a testimony that even emperors could not erase. 2 millennia later, we still speak his name with revulsion. That endurance is its own kind of justice. The price of memory is heavy, but necessary. To remember Tiberius is to remember how thin the line is between civilization and savagery, how easily power corrodes virtue, how silence enables monstrosity. Rome bore that price in scars. History bears it still.